Hey guys, it's Brandon, creator of Happily Dressed, a sewing resource dedicated to self-acceptance, self-confidence, and self-sufficiency, and welcome back to the channel. Today is a fun DIY video altering an already existing free pattern on the internet, and that is the Paola Jacket by fabricstore.com. I love this jacket. I've literally made so many iterations of it, dressing it up, dressing it down, casual wear, formal wear. I love this pattern, and today I'm going to show you how I did this circle detail with like a hidden pocket. I say it's hidden, you can still kind of see it, but with a hidden pocket, and then also that same circle detail continues on the back. I first did this hack back in 2022, so I'm excited to finally have a YouTube video for it. In the description down below is where you'll find everything you need for this DIY pattern hack, plus where you can go and download this pattern for free will also be linked down below. Without further ado, let's get started. Alright, so once you've chosen your size using the size and yardage chart on page 4, you can print out your pattern. I can't remember if this is page 5 or 3, but there is a printing layout page that shows you how all of your pattern pieces are supposed to be taped together. This will be really helpful when you're assembling your pattern. But before we can assemble a pattern, we have to go through and cut off the right and bottom edge of each piece of paper, so that way we can tile them together easily. Also, another fun fact, whenever I'm using a pattern that's already been made, not by me, but it's been tested and approved, I like to print it on cardstock because it's thicker paper and it allows the paper pattern to last longer. So this is cardstock. But now I'm going to go through and use my paper cutter to cut off the right and bottom edges. You could also use a rotary cutter and acrylic see-through ruler to do this as well. Alright, so once you're done taping your pattern together, I went ahead and split it into the first 3 rows and the last 2 rows. I'm going to put this one off to the side while I cut this next one out. And if you don't have Adobe Acrobat and weren't able to print out just your size, you can take a highlighter and go through and highlight the right size that's yours before you start cutting out to make it easier. So now that we have all of our pieces cut out, we can start directly on the pattern hack. One thing I like to do before I even start carving out the circular part on the front and the back is actually shorten it. I have a pretty short torso, so I like my jackets to sit like an inch or an inch and a half past my waistband. So for those of you who also want to crop your Paola jacket, what I like to do is take a measuring tape, put it at the center of my shoulder, right in the middle, and then measure down where I want the garment to end. And right now it's sitting at about 20. Because I went up a size in this jacket, I actually want to go up an inch as well to 21. So from the top of my shoulder to the bottom of the jacket, I want the finished garment measurement to be 21 inches. Once you get your number, you have to remember to also add in the seam allowance that the pattern comes with. So for main seams, like the shoulder seam, the seam allowance is 5/8. And then the hem on the actual garment is 1.5 inches. So I'll take my 21-inch finished garment length, add it to the hem allowance of 1.5 inches. That's 22.5 inches. And then add 5/8, which I can try to do the math right now. 23 1/8. So now on my pattern piece for my front and my back, I'm gonna go to the middle of the shoulder and measure down 23 1/8 and mark there. So now starting with my front pattern piece, I'm gonna go to the middle of the shoulder seam, measure down until I get to 23 1/8 of an inch. I wanna make sure that my measuring tape is straight. And to make things easier, I could just round to 23. And then I'm gonna draw a straight line across. This will be my cut line. And then now that I have that cut line established, to do the same to the back, I can actually just measure the distance from that line down. And for me, it's exactly 5.5. So I'm taking off 5.5 inches from the original pattern. So then I'll grab my back and from there measure 5.5 inches up from the bottom and then mark that all the way through. So now before I cut off this 5.5 inches, I want to make sure there aren't any notches I have to transfer. There is one on the front right here at the very bottom. So I'm going to use my acrylic ruler to transfer this notch right here at the bottom up to its new place, which is right here on my new end of the pattern. So now I can take my rotary cutter or scissors and cut now the new bottom of my jacket pattern. And because we won't be using any of these pockets, it's okay that we've just cut through the pocket line and then cut the bottom off as well. So here are my new front and back pieces, now cropped to the length that I want them to be, including the seam allowance of the 1.5 inch hem plus 5/8 in the shoulder. And once you cut down your front and back pieces, the only other piece you have to alter will be your facing because it connects to the front. So I'm gonna measure 5.5 inches up from the bottom of the facing and cut that off as well. Now starting with the back piece, we're gonna work on our curved panel. The exact curve I did on my last Paola jacket, which was a size down, but I think I'm gonna still use the same measurement. 7 inches over is where the line started, and then 5 inches down, 5.5 inches down is where this line started. So using my acrylic ruler again, I'm gonna measure out 7 inches from the edge here on this side. And notice here, our back piece will be cut on a fold. So the two pieces we'll end up having will both need to be cut on a fold, which just means cutting it on top of a folded piece of fabric. So you get one big piece. So I'm gonna go out to 7, make a mark, come over here. So I'm gonna take that line all the way up like this. And then I'm gonna measure down 5.5 inches and draw that line all the way over as well. So now I have a big rectangle, which will be a great starting point for our curve, because what we really want is continue a straight line for as long as we can to ensure that our pattern pieces will line up. But then from there, you can kind of just freehand a curve that you enjoy. So that curve is actually pretty nice. I can have it come in more if I wanted to, but I kind of like this smaller curve that I have going on here. This is where you get to play and experiment. I do like this shorter curve that's happening right here, but feel free to make it wider if you want to by going in more up here and down more here. But for right now, I'm loving this. So now you want to create little notches for you to be able to line up your pattern pieces. And these can be placed anywhere throughout this line we just drawn, because these notches will be transferred to both pieces of the pattern to make sure when we're lining it all up, it all lines up evenly. So just in different places of your pattern, go ahead and mark in some notches over both lines. So now I'm gonna take my rotary cutter and cut on the line we just drew, separating the pattern piece into two different pieces. This is harder to do when I'm trying to film, but I'm trying to make it as smooth as possible. So now I have my two separate pattern pieces for the curved back, and both have notches where everything is supposed to meet. One thing I will do is draw back in this little arrow, acknowledging that this piece should also be cut on the fold. But then after that, we're not done just yet, because now we need to add seam allowance to both these pieces so we can retain the initial measurements that were built into this pattern. So to add your seam allowance, you can use craft paper, pattern drafting paper, whatever you have available, even fabric itself, but go ahead and cut out a piece where both of your pieces can fit on top of. And then what we're gonna do is tape them down close to their edge so they don't shift. I would avoid taping over your notches because it'll make it hard to draw over with the tape being there. But we're gonna do this for both pattern pieces. Once both your pieces are taped down, we're gonna use our acrylic ruler to add in some seam allowance. So to keep this hack synonymous with the pattern seam allowance, we're gonna add 5/8 of an inch seam allowance to both these pieces. So I'm gonna take my acrylic ruler, find 5/8 of an inch here. So I'm gonna go to the notch that's right after the 1/2 inch notch and mark my new seam allowance. Around the curved parts, you'll wanna take your time to make sure you get it right. But you'll do the same thing, just at different points. Here we go, 5/8. And I'm just making little lines that I will be able to connect once I'm done. And now I'll connect my seam allowance with my original pattern. That's back one, done. Now we're gonna move on to back two. So once you finish drawing in your seam allowance for back piece number 2, you can trace your little dashes, but then close off your pattern piece by connecting it to the seam allowance. And now the last thing we need to do is transfer our notches further down the pattern so we know where to connect these two pieces. And you don't want your actual notch to be more than your seam allowance. So now that I've transferred all my notches to the new seam allowance, I can cut out these pattern pieces one more time. And you actually don't have to cut out the whole thing. You can just cut out the seam allowance part and then cut the brown paper down around it. But now here are your two new back pieces We want to make sure to remember that both of these will be cut on the fold. And now we can put this aside and work on the front. On my original version of this, when I used the 12-14, I went over 9. I think for the 16-18, which is the size I'm using, I'm going to go over 9.5 to kind of just fill out this space a little bit more. Do what you feel is appropriate for your size. But I'm going to go over 9.5 inches and start to create my little rectangle like we did with the back. So I'll make a mark and then use my acrylic ruler to draw the straight line. And then from the top down, I measured 7.5 inches. And now I'll draw that straight line. So now I have my rectangle to be able to do the curve. So this curve I don't want to be as shallow as the last one. I want it to start a little sooner. So I'm going to measure about 4 inches. Mark there. Measure up about 9 inches. And then now I'm going to connect those 2 points. I think not having such a shallow curve at this point allows for more shaping in the front detail. So I'm just freehanding this, but feel free to use a curved ruler if you feel more confident and comfortable doing that. So that's my new curve for the front. It isn't as shallow as the back, just because it reads a little better when it's a longer curve in the front. What I'm going to do next is mark our hem allowance, because this is going to be helpful when we make our pocket, because our pocket will double as an outside pocket and an inside pocket because it'll be sewn into the hem and into the facing of the jacket. I'm going to go to the bottom and measure up 1.5 inches and mark that as my hem allowance. And there's one more thing to do, I forgot it again, and that's make our notches, because we want to make sure our 2 new pattern pieces for the front line up the way they're supposed to. And then now we can cut this out. Okay, so before we add the seam allowance to these 2 end pieces, what we want to do is add in our invisible pocket markings onto this piece. And for me, I want my pocket opening to be 5.5 inches, and I want the depth to be 3/8. This will give it that appearance of being invisible because it'll be really close to where the seam meets, but you'll still be able to have access to it. So lining my pattern pieces up so I can see kind of where I want the pocket to start. I actually think right here is a great place, and it'll end right here. So this is 5.5 inches right here for me, because that's a good opening for my hand to fit through, is 5.5 inches. I'm going to start the pocket at this notch here, and that'll help me combine these 2 pieces because I'll know that this notch on this side matches up with the start of the opening of the pocket. And then I'm going to change this notch down here to be where the pocket ends, which is this 5.5 inch mark. So this one is my new notch, and I will disregard this one. So now that I've added these new notches in for the pockets and disregard the other ones, I'll separate these and draw in what my pocket will look like. Because these 2 points right here, the corners of the pocket, will eventually be used as markings to be able to draw in the pocket on the actual fabric. So go ahead and mark those corners with a circle. Now, using my remaining scraps of that craft paper, for you it can be pattern paper, I'm going to take these pieces down and add the seam allowance. Okay, so now we're gonna make the pockets pattern piece. So actually I just grabbed another sheet of cardstock, but to make this pocket, we're gonna determine the length and width of what we want it to be. You want the pocket to extend at least 1 inch above where it opens. And then for the length, you want it to be caught in this 1.5 inch hem. It doesn't have to go all the way down. That's gonna be 8 inches. And then measuring from the pattern piece, not the seam allowance, you want to measure over to make sure this front placket part isn't too thick. I'm going to use my front facing piece, line it up with the edge of that pattern piece, and then from there I can tell that actually 8.5 works better because it also frees up some space here. So now using my cardstock and moving my other piece out of the way, I'm going to draw an 8 by 8.5 box. Go ahead and cut this out. And then I know the top of this is 1 inch above the opening. So I'm going to draw in our opening marks because we will need to draw in our pocket opening. So here is 1 inch down from the top. And then I know my pocket opening is 5.5 inches wide. So now I'm going to measure down 5.5 inches from that point. And there are my 2 pocket notches that match up with these 2. So then now I'm going to draw 3/8 of an inch over and then down. So with this pocket piece, we actually want to cut 2 pairs of 2 Paola Jacket hack pocket cut 4. And in parentheses you can even put 2 mirroring pairs of 2. So now what we have to do to this is add a seam allowance, and we're going to do 5/8 of an inch all the way around. So once you finish adding the seam allowance of 5/8 of an inch to all 4 corners, there's just a few more things that we have to do. We're going to extend that pocket opening line so we know exactly how deep we need to sew on this pocket to create the opening we're looking for, including the seam allowance. And also marking these corners with a dot, because we will use an awl to punch through that to be able to make our markings on the actual pocket fabric. So now our 3 pattern pieces for the front are now complete. We have front 1, front 2, and then the pocket as well. That'll connect within the hem and the front facing here. So that will be a working inside pocket from the top and then a working outside pocket from the side. So now the only thing that's left to do before we start cutting into our actual fabric is marking the notches on all of our pattern pieces. I'll be using this notcher to do that. I got this off of Amazon and it'll also be linked down below. But this will help us just have a better visual representation of where our pieces are supposed to line up. But now we can cut into our fabric and get started sewing. Now with cutting out your pattern pieces, you actually might need more fabric than what's recommended because we've split up 2 of the pattern pieces. So I would recommend getting more fabric than is listed because of that. So to start the construction of this jacket, I like to start with the back. It kind of gets you used to the curved seams, how to sew it all. And since we marked our notches, I can go ahead and put these to the side. So we want to connect these right sides facing. So what we want it to look at the end is this. So we're gonna take it and flip it this way and start to pin our notches together. And this is why it's important to have your notches, because it helps you figure out the placement. Once you take your time, you should be able to get it to where everything is lining up in a decent way. But now we're gonna take this over to the sewing machine and sew it down at 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. All right, after the seam is sewn, what I'm gonna do is take it to my serger and serge the edges. You can also, if you don't have a serger, use a zigzag stitch or use binding on the edges, because what we're gonna do is press it out this way. And then on the opposite side, top stitch it down twice around the edge. But look at that, looks pretty nice. I will say though, using 5/8 of an inch seam allowance does make sewing these curves a little harder because the seam allowance is so big. But I didn't want to give you guys a seam allowance that you would have to continue to remember. But if you're okay with that, then I would do 3/8 of an inch seam allowance for all your curves. And actually, before we take it over to the iron, we're gonna clip into our curves to make sure it lays down more flat. But also, if you did a smaller seam allowance, like 3/8 of an inch, you might not have to do this. I'm just gonna put some small snips into these curves to make them relax more and easier to press. That should be enough. Now on to pressing and top stitching. So here is the back top stitch. It looks pretty good, I cannot lie. I love the top stitching thread that I chose for this project. I almost went with white. I think this was a really cool option too. And then this is what the inside looks like. Just top stitched down. I used a black thread as the bobbin thread. But now we're done with our back piece. We've had practice doing our curves. Now we can move on to the front. All right, to get started on the front, we're actually gonna start with the lower front piece and a pair of our pocket bag, because we're gonna start to sew this invisible pocket. So working with your pocket bag, wrong side up, because that's how we're gonna attach it to this front piece. I'm gonna find my notches. Here they are. And once I have my notches on this side, I'm gonna take my pattern piece and then use my awl to punch a hole in those corners. And then once I've lined up my notches, I'm going to use chalk or some kind of marking tool to draw in this half rectangle. So now I have the box that needs to be sewn. So I can grab my bottom front piece once again, line up these notch marks. And this is with right sides facing, because the right side of the pocket bag is facing the right side of the bottom front piece. I'm going to pin this in place and then sew right on top of this box that I made. Now once that is sewn, I'm gonna take my scissors and trim down that seam allowance, as well as cut into my corners. You wanna make sure you don't cut through your stitching line, but you cut right to the corner of that seam you just sewn. And then from there, what we can do is flip this towards the inside, start to shape the pocket opening, and then go to the iron and give this a press. And then on the top half, we're gonna top stitch this the same way we top stitched the back. So once you're done, it should look something like this. We have beautiful top stitching on the pocket opening. I'm also realizing that your pocket bag fabric should match as well as you can to the fabric that you're using, because it will peek out just a hair once this is sewn, because this is also our seam allowance, so it'll probably be like just this much that does peek out. So I'm very thankful to have used a fabric that's very similar to the color of the jacket that I'm making. So now I'm gonna take my other pocket piece, place it on top of what we just did, pin it to the first pocket bag only, and then sew this down at 5/8 of an inch. So once that's sewn in place, it should look something like this. I went ahead and serged down the edges as well. You're more than welcome to trim them down, use bias tape. This is what I've done, but now we're gonna do the fun part and connect it to the front. So we're gonna find our corresponding front piece, and just like we did our back, pin this together using our notches. So this is how it's supposed to be. We're gonna turn it this way and go ahead and start to pin that all the way around. I've noticed around these big curves, if you do use 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, that it's helpful to pin in this direction instead of trying to pin in the direction that you're sewing, like I did here, here, and here. But if you just pin straight down, you're able to grab the fabric a little better. And when you sew, you should be able to move through this seam a little easier without having to deal with straight horizontal pins. That actually helped tremendously to get this sewn on, but now just like the back, we're going to clip into our corner to make sure we can press this as flat as possible, and then take it over to the iron to give it a good press. But as you can see, our pocket is sewn. So here is what your first front should look like, all sewn up and top stitched. And then we have the pocket on the back as well, which once it's encased, it'll also become a top-down pocket here in the back. But go ahead and do this for your other front. So once you finish the hack for your two front pieces, you can follow the instructions for the Paola Workwear Jacket from their website. It's a free pattern and comes with free instructions. I'll leave a link down below to the blog post where the instructions are located. But now I'm just gonna follow those and finish this jacket. Also, when you're sewing your facing onto the front bodice with the collar, don't be alarmed that your facing is shorter than the end, because it's gonna get caught up in that 1.5 inch hem once we hem this jacket. So yeah, don't be worried that you cut this too short, because you didn't. It's gonna get caught in that hem when we sew it later. So now that I've top stitched the front side of this facing, I top stitched that all the way around. Now before I top stitch this outside decorative stitch to keep this facing down, I want to turn my jacket wrong side out and prep these pockets to make sure they get sewn in when I sew down this facing. And because I'm going to be stitching this from the front, I'm just going to take a few pins and pin this down, making sure to pin through all layers, and this will start to create our internal pocket. So now I'm gonna do that to the other side, and then go ahead and add the decorative top stitch that also sews down the facing on the back. Alright guys, so we're right at the end where we're gonna hem the bottom, hem the sleeves, and then add the buttons and buttonholes. But I want to come on here and say that I did not account for the bottom of the pocket when trying to keep the hemming allowance, because when I tried to turn this up 1.5 inches, it runs right into the bottom of this pocket. So I'm actually gonna do 1 inch hem at the bottom, and that should be enough. But hopefully you're watching this before you actually do it, and you can add in another inch of like safety room if you did crop your jacket. But yeah, hopefully the next clip will actually be the finished jacket. Okay, are you guys ready for the finished piece? I said, are you ready for the finished piece? Here it is. This is how I'm gonna wear it. There's no music playing. But yeah, here it is. Obviously I have it buttoned up here, but actually here, I'll turn around. But the back looks so good. The sleeves, I like the length because my blue ones, the sleeves are like up here. So sizing up did bring down the sleeves a lot more. They are a little big, but I think that'll be perfect for like a hoodie. Maybe next time I'd bring it in more. But yeah, I love the way this is turned out. The pockets are great, they work. Look at that. They work here on the outside. They also work here. A phone fits right and good in there. But yeah, super excited with how this turned out. Big fan of the pockets. I will say, I'm glad I caught that hem issue. Also, this is what it looks like fully buttoned up. My curves are off by like 1/4 of an inch, and that's gonna annoy the heck out of me. If you do make the Paola jacket and use this hack and post it on Instagram, be sure to tag me at Happily Dressed so I can see it. If you found this video helpful, you can give it a big thumbs up. That helps me out as a creator here on YouTube. And also comment down below, would you make this? Are you excited to make this? Has this tutorial made it seem a little bit more approachable? Either way, I can't wait to see what you make. And until next time, I'll catch you all in my next video. See you guys later.